Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing, game design, hobbies, project planning, world building, and all things creativity.
Well, this is the third of our Feelings About D&D podcasts. And in this one, we're going to talk about the social aspect of D&D and our concerns with that.
Hopefully it will be our last, criticism of D&D podcast. Again, to reiterate, this isn't a review. We're not bashing D&D. We're not saying you shouldn't play D&D. These are our feelings about how D&D works. And specifically this time, the community around D&D and how that works and how we feel about it and in how we feel about it in our situation. Now, we talked about this a couple of times already, but Liz and I tend to do one-on-one role-playing at this point because sometimes we have group games and sometimes we don't have group games, and we can always default to playing one-on-one if we have a game that we want to run for each other.
And it also allows us to tell interesting and very specifically tailored stories that we really want to tell that, are set up just for the other person that we're running the game for. So it really allows us to do some interesting and innovative stories. Intimate. Yeah.
There because we're married and we talk about a lot of things, we agree about a lot of things. I feel like we have probably a very privileged position in role-playing society where we can, approach subjects that would just not, first of all, not even be socially acceptable in other, in a public circle, right? And then other things that would be kind of touchy and things that we would want to pre-vet in a session 0 with other people. But for us, we can have a session 0 while one of us is standing in the shower and the other one's doing their hair in the morning and be like, hey, what would you think of this thing? And then be like, nah, that sounds like bullshit. And we'll be like, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah. And then that's that, right? So we're talking about the social aspects of D&D today. This isn't what we don't mean is social encounters in D&D. We've already talked about the mechanics. We've already talked about the kind of design work of D&D. Today we're talking about the culture surrounding D&D and the effects of that culture on the game and vice versa.
Yeah, and we're not even really going to get into, a lot of the cultural phenomenon of D&D, right, and, the popularity of a lot of, D&D podcasts and, famous D&D groups. That's fantastic. I love the fact that there's so much more focus and I can talk to coworkers about it who are normal people, and they kind of have an inkling of what I'm talking about now.
Pretty surreal.
Which is amazing. Yeah. So we're not talking about that side of it. We're kind of talking about a niche part of that, a subset of that. Right.
We're really only kind of talking about the niggling issues of that are causing problems, reasons that we are less comfortable in D&D land within this subsegment of content.
And the first thing we want to talk about is very 5th edition focused. It started to crop up in 4th as well, but since 4th didn't have as big of a cultural impact, it didn't really mean as much. But that is de-emphasizing higher levels.
Which to me, coming from 2nd edition and 3.5, when we actually had a specific book called the Epic Level Handbook, is like a slap in the face. I'm so mad.
And I just don't get it. If you're really invested in your character, and maybe this is the narrativist in me talking about it, but if you're really invested in your character, wouldn't we want to see them get to the point where they're a legend or a demigod or, that level of notoriety in your world that you're playing in and in your game that you're playing in? Why wouldn't you want to go all the way there up to the higher levels and be that badass, goddess?
That's it's so surreal to me because it's like a complete disconnect from the mindset of D&D. D&D is so I like to call it avaricious because you as a player really want the things of D&D. You want It's designed to make you want to level up and to get new cool stuff and get better powers and get new spells and get better weapons and magic items and stuff. That's what it's all about, right? Is getting cool stuff. And the idea that some people want to like not follow that path to the logical extent, that some people are just cool with like, yeah, you know, we just played some D&D and we're just going to be level 6, is like, what? Like, I can hardly get into that mindset.
And we've talked about this before, not in podcasts, but we've talked about the fact that it feels like 5th edition has also de-emphasized giving weapons, magical items rather.
Right.
Sorry.
Yes.
Giving magical items out, like magical weapons, rare items, like that's not as much of a thing to get the treasure and the loot.
Well, they tried to.
Yeah, and then they had to go back and give some treasure options.
Yeah. There was that whole fiasco with in the DMG. They kind of tried to say, look, you don't have to give your players magic items. The entire game can be played without magic items. And like everybody was kind of like, yeah, but there are creatures that have this thing called damage resistance, you know, to like anything. And so, you know, it became kind of like, what are you talking? Like all the legit players who have played like 3.5 were like, no, you're objectively wrong. We are going to need magic items. You're just trying to de-emphasize them because magic items were such a huge problem in 3.5. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they released Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and they have charts in there for like the charts they didn't have in the DMG. So, whoopsies.
I'm a greedy little dragon, though. Right. I want all of that treasure. Like,
absolutely,
give it to me.
Right. Me too. Absolutely. 100%. I need all the stuff. I want all the cool things. I want to use a Vorpal sword while wearing a cloak of invisibility and smiting somebody with a rod of lordly might in my offhand. That's what I want. While wearing a robe of the Archmagi over my cloak of invisibility, which somehow works.
Because, of course. Explain it all the way with fiction.
That is. Up next, let's talk about this sounds like a topic that should have probably come up in our mechanics episode, but I mean, I kind of consider it more of a social issue because most people deal with it as a social problem as opposed to a mechanical problem. And that's experience points. From what I've heard, the point of view of most players and GMs at this point is just forget about experience points, do milestone-based gaming. And I agree with that, but what I still find bizarre is that the experience chart still exists and it still functions the same way that it used to. So people playing milestone-based D&D are playing a fundamentally different structure of D&D as those of us, or those people trying to play experience-based D&D. We actually tried this between me and Liz with the Margarin game that we've talked about a few times in the past. The entire point of that game, where Liz was playing a warlock, was to initially just try to see how long it was going to take to do experience-based leveling up.
We eventually gave up and switched over to Milestone, and then gave up completely, but that's a different story.
Yeah, it was excruciating. Like the reason why I think this is a social issue is because it comes up because people don't have infinite amounts of time to play D&D. And I would be ashamed if I was a GM and I forced players to play by an experience model that, like, basically through the entire time period of a campaign kept them at like level 6. I would feel like a terrible GM because they don't get to do the cool stuff. They don't get to level up that much in that system. And even with milestone based experience, it's very easy to be like, oh yeah, no, we haven't hit a milestone, and like to go months and months without hitting a milestone because we just haven't hit the right story beat or plot beat or whatever.
We've just wandered around in the forest aimlessly for 3 months of playtime.
Right. Getting confused because maybe we didn't pick up the plot hooks or something. Yeah. That's probably more of a problem with module-based play where you have like specific objectives to hit. See previous podcasts for a little bit about how to plan a world-building exercise in a way that'll be easier for you to use.
And our feelings about modules.
And also, we will be eventually doing a podcast about the system that I have kind of coined, which I call the switchboard engine, which allows you to more effectively leverage your planning to have a more flexible game. But that's for a future podcast. Point being, the experience point system is just crazy. And if the majority of people are not using it, then I think that means that it's broken.
Yeah.
Or
or only really applicable for the true sadists out there who have a lot of time to spend.
At that point, shouldn't it just be an optional rule? Should they just move the experience point chart to an optional rule table in the back of the DMG maybe?
Yeah, it might be a thing. And I think the way the experience points are set up anyways is not fantastic. We've talked a little bit about game theory and, how experience gets set up in MMOs. And usually if you're playing an MMO, those first few levels are really easy.
Right.
Like they hook you in, they've got you addicted. You've gotten your first few levels. You get that dopamine hit of like leveling up to 4th or 5th or 6th level. And then it gets a little harder and then it gets a little harder. And D&D doesn't do that a lot.
I mean, it does, but the chart slopes that direction, but I guess the way the encounter building goes, it kind of negates that to some extent, and it's never really that easy to level up.
Yeah,
I don't know. I feel like maybe the real problem is just that experience chart is just too huge. I think that maybe it would be worth looking at just shrinking all the numbers, like divide everything by like 5 or something and see what that looks like. Because what we realized in the Margaret game was that the entire experiment had been a miserable failure from the get-go because I had been miscalculating experience from the start. I had accidentally been giving people, I had not been dividing the total experience by the number of people in the party. So everybody was getting like 4 or 5 times the amount of experience. And we were like, man, this is kind of slow. So I can only imagine we were playing for a little while there. We were playing like 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And it was still pretty agonizingly slow to level those characters up. I can only imagine what that would be like if you only could play like once every 2 weeks with your friends, man. Like that's the thing I think that makes this a social issue is that you have to consider the pragmatic real world situation that players are in, right? Like you might, and this kind of comes back around to the whole the higher levels are de-emphasized. That seems to be largely because people can't keep long running games going anymore. In the old days, grognards could play a D&D campaign for 10 years, right? Like that was like, okay, well, yeah, good job, These days people who don't have that same level of like ferocious devotion are playing, and they don't get to play that much. They don't get to play that campaign that much. And so they have a much shorter campaign time, which means they don't get to level up as much. And that's what, going back to our first episode about tradition, that's a huge tradition that is causing problems for the raw game design just because it's the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
Don't use experience points, please. Use
milestones and make sure that you've got good milestones.
Yeah, and consider upping the ante relatively frequently because realistically, you're not going to have that many sessions with your friends. Yeah. Use them wisely, right? Don't drag it out.
And if you want to tell an epic or a more epic story, start off at a higher level. There's nothing wrong with starting at 5th or 10th level and going from there and really using characters that have already gotten themselves built up and have some experience under their belts.
Yeah, and I mean, you can do all kinds of things with that. You can start with PCs that the players have already played. You can allow them to come up with rich, elaborate backstories. You can, kind of freeform role play a bunch of previous material. You can even one of the things that I liked to do back in the old days when I was running a lot more D&D was I would like to start characters at a higher level, but then have them all discuss what their inter-character backstory was and what had happened previously, so that they all kind of had buy-in about not just their own personal history and their own personal backstory, but the backstory of the whole party and what kinds of challenges they'd already accomplished. Okay, so the next section, the next topic that we have to talk about is specific to us, because as we've said, we do a lot of one-on-one role playing, and this is definitely the most obviously slanted issue that we have that is very specific to that case, which is that D&D is fundamentally made for party play. That means that it is extremely hard to run one-on-one D&D. And there are a number of reasons for this. The two biggest ones are that your character in D&D is designed to have gaps. You need a party to fill in your gaps. You, as a fighter, you need a rogue to do the talky talk and the sneaky sneak. You need a wizard to do the smart people stuff. You need a druid to slap animals around or whatever it is that druids do. You need those other people there to support you, right? Like it's the team that succeeds in D&D. And the other thing is that encounters are just not going to work the way you want them to unless you're like massively homebrewing tons and tons of monsters or you use some specific tool, of which I have written several specifically for this problem. You're going to have a really tough time trying to make encounters for a single player because it's going to be really swingy, because as soon as like one person gains the upper hand, it can go south really fast.
Yeah.
But also that it's just like the monster CRs are designed for a party of 4, not a party of 1. So now you have to figure out how to downscale your XP budget, and the action economy is so complicated that makes it even more swingy.
And a great example of this is actually a like little one-shot dungeon crawl that I ran for Joe, and I needed some just low-level cannon fodder sort of monsters to put in there.
This is so stupid.
I'm so sorry about this, dear. So I went with pixies because I was going for kind of like a twisted abandoned forest kind of feel. And I didn't realize when I first designed the encounter that pixies actually really don't have an attack. Very much so. I'm like, I'll just give them some teeth. They just bite for like 1d4 damage. It won't be that bad.
Except that there were like 16 of them or something.
No, there was only 5. There were 5 pixies.
Well, it felt like a lot more.
Well, because they kind of became sharks and chewed you to pieces.
Sparkly flying forest sharks. That's what happened.
Yeah. And so it was so swingy that my 5 little toothy pixies almost killed Joe's character. And
in the first encounter.
Yeah, in the first encounter. It was unexpected and really swingy. And
now, I mean, granted, like that was a manipulation of the rules, right?
Yeah.
Like the pixies are not designed to have teeth, and if they had teeth, then maybe they would have had a different CR, and then you would have built the encounter more differently. But like that by itself is an excellent example of a GM or a DM just trying to make the game better, and D&D itself being a trap for that behavior.
Sparkly little forest sharks.
Sparkly little forest sharks. God, I still have nightmares. Okay. All right. Get your can of worms out, get your pitchforks out, and get ready to open your can of worms with your pitchfork, because it's about to get real. This is flame war time.
Sacred cow
on the altar right now. We're talking about D&D Beyond. And I think this one is mostly applicable to us, but also applicable to other people as well. So this is not one of the things that I would say is only our problem. And that is that D&D Beyond, oh my gosh, I love D&D Beyond so much. I'm a supporter. I pay money for it, and I love it. And if I play in another game, I can almost guarantee that I will probably be using D&D Beyond to run my character.
Yeah, most definitely. It just makes managing your character a lot easier.
So much easier.
But
I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
And before, don't get your put your pitchforks away for the moment, because what we don't mean is that it's too easy and too many people are playing D&D. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not saying that, D&D Beyond has lowered the barrier to entry and all the plebeians have started playing. That's not what we mean. I want more people to play D&D. I want people to play more role-playing games. What we're saying is that D&D Beyond is like a trap. trap. It's like a sticky honeypot that lures you in with a false sense of security and says, oh, you're done. Don't worry about it, right? And it's so alluring and easy that there are a lot of things that it can lure you into not thinking about. And some of this, I'm going to say, probably sounds elitist to some people. I think that D&D Beyond is frequently in danger of obscuring cool stuff that you could do that isn't within the bounds of D&D Beyond. Just as an example, in the Margarin game, I had an NPC for Liz that was a floating magic tome. And unfortunately, I pretty much just had to kind of make that character up because for the most part, it was not possible to accomplish that character in D&D Beyond. Basically, what I ended up doing is like just using human stats and kind of hand waving some stuff and changing some things on the sheet. That's the kind of thing that I would normally just write into a character sheet or just sort of decide on the fly because it's not fundamentally that important, right? Like the fact that she flies and can fly at 30 feet as opposed to walk at 30 feet, she's a book, so she's not going to carry anybody any great distance or anything. We haven't really like shot ourselves in the foot tactically by giving you a character that can fly a little bit, right? But those are things that are like more difficult to do in D&D Beyond, and that kind of rolls into the next thing, which is, or rather, that's portion of the problem that it's hard to homebrew stuff in D&D Beyond. You can do it, and there are some things that are a little bit easier to do where you can just kind of directly edit the character sheet and say like, oh, well, I'm going to override this and do this thing. But generally speaking, if you want to like add a race or you want to add like a cool item or something, that's a lot of work. It's not like you can just type it in. There's a big series of wizards and section pages and like metadata that you have to add just to add this thing. And that's like that because D&D Beyond is so easy and that's so much harder. It's kind of directing people away from some of the more creative aspects that you can accomplish in D&D.
And one of the things that I struggle with D&D Beyond is actually leveling characters up. D&D Beyond makes leveling characters up easy, which I actually find to be an issue because when you're leveling a character up on paper, I find that I'm spending a lot of the time, really seeing what's changing with my character, getting comfortable, with new hit dice, getting comfortable with new skills, getting comfortable with everything that's changed. And with D&D Beyond, it's so easy to just bloop, push button, level up, yay. You might select a couple things you have a choice between, but it's not really everything. And then I found that I was actually missing a lot of the changes that occurred for my character. So when I'm playing a rogue, I would like frequently forget that, I had more sneak attack dice. Now I had 3 instead of 2 when I leveled up, just because it was so easy and so behind the scenes that unless I specifically knew what changed and specifically looked through my character sheet to find all of the new stuff, I didn't necessarily know that. And, maybe a bit of that's on me for not spending the time to actually
like refamiliarize yourself.
Right. With what's going on. But then, some of that I think I would have known had I done that on paper. I would have known exactly what had changed.
Absolutely.
And already had that kind of like filtered into my brain of this is how my character is different now.
Right. And I feel, I agree. And I feel like that also kind of diffuses the excitement of leveling up when you can just push button and level up. Yeah. And I don't know. I don't think there is necessarily a solution to that problem because I think that its goal is to make things easier, right? And it does an excellent job of that. Yeah. But at the same time, I feel like that's a component of the process that I almost wish I had to do manually, right? Like, or at least that there was some mechanism by which it would like hold my hand and like walk me through it or something.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
You gain this. You gain this. You gain this. And like say, okay, here's all the things that changed, or like maybe even just like a report. There's like, these are your deltas. Here's your skill changes or whatever. And
maybe give an option to toggle that on and off. So if you want to get walked through all the changes, awesome. If you don't and you just want to push button level up, you push the button and level up. And I'm conflicted on this because I think it's both good and bad for new players. I've got the experience under my belt to know stuff changes when you level up and to look for things like that. And I'm even still missing that. But I think for like a completely new player, you might be very confused about why stuff has changed.
Right. You might not even know.
Right. But on the other hand, I think D&D Beyond makes it really easy for new players to come into the game, which is fantastic, that it makes it super easy to build a character and you don't have to spend, 30 hours looking through all the different books to try to figure out all of your options and then like have to ask 10 people on how to fill out your character sheet.
My favorite story about that is actually when I was at Gamehole Con a couple of years ago, right when D&D Beyond was like kind of becoming a thing. I was, between panels and stuff, and this was before we had our own Void Spiral table. And I just happened to, like, other people were in, I think, a Pat Rothfuss podcast or a panel or something. And I was like, I've been to a Pat Rothfuss before. And I kind of sat out, and I was just hanging out, waiting for people's panels to be done. And I was in the upper level lounge and just kind of sat around. I was looking at my phone, and I was like listening to some guys like theorycraft some character, and they were like trying to argue. I think they were belaboring a point about what spell was better, and I like kind of just leaned over and gave them some advice, just because it's a gaming convention. That's what you do. You talk to people about games. And so they basically just invited me into their game, and they were going to do a throwdown module, like just a little dungeon adventure right there on the couches. And they're like, oh yeah, you should try D&D Beyond. And I'm like, oh, I heard about it. I haven't tried it yet. And they're like, oh, just, go on this page. We'll send you a link. And like in 10 minutes, I had myself I think a cleric, and I was playing with these guys, and like, their panel started or something, and we were all splitting up, and I like kind of shook hands and talked to these guys, and it turned out they were from Curse Gaming and they were the guys making the D&D Beyond app. And I was just like, you guys are really cool people, you know that?
So we really like D&D Beyond, but...
Right. I think that's why these podcasts are really hard for us, is because we really do love D&D, and it really kind of breaks our hearts to know that there are flaws there that make us not want to play D&D, because we know that there's something we would rather play.
And we keep trying.
We keep trying, you guys. Oh, I mean, and so for those of you who are just stumbling in to Joe's table now, I am a game designer. I design games. I've done several at this point that have been successfully kickstarted. And I'm still designing games, and I'm still designing what I hope to be like kind of our magnum opus for the company. And even now, as I'm kind of collating my kind of ultimate system, I'm still looking back at D&D going, ooh, shoot, should I build more crunch into this thing? Or should I add in feats or special powers? Oh no, what if... I kind of feel like I should play some more D&D. And I'm, it's so deeply ingrained in my soul that I can't get away from it.
Yeah. And we were talking recently about like which games that we've played have been the really showstopper games that we remember.
Right.
And since Joe and I started gaming together, especially doing one-on-one games, not a single one of those has been D&D.
Yeah.
Which is really
true.
sad.
Now, to be fair, some of my like our friends group's favorite campaigns have been in D&D. But some of them have also not been.
Yeah.
Especially recently.
Yep.
So maybe we've put it to bed. Maybe we can rest our case on D&D. I think we've covered all the topics that we wanted to talk about in terms of things that we have problems with in D&D land for our personal gaming adventures. So we're gonna wrap up the series here, but we might still talk more about D&D in the future on the podcast, just because there are probably more things to discuss about it. Probably things that'll come up that will be like elitistly walk in and be like, hey, here's a good solution to this problem you seem to have in D&D land, and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure I will not be able to resist the siren call of telling people that they're wrong. But yeah, for now, we're putting it to bed. And you can look forward to more podcasts that will probably be about world building.
And other gaming systems.
Pros and cons. look forward to a podcast about the switchboard engine system of running games that we've been talking about. I would like to do one on the information economy in RPGs and how that's extremely vital to running a good game. We've got a lot of cool content coming up, so I'm excited about it. We pretty much spent the entire weekend just podcasting so far, so I think this is a thing that we could do for a while.
Yeah, definitely.
So stay tuned, folks. I'm Joe.
I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table signing off. See you next time, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Peace.